It is a tremendous honor to introduce this year's Baker Peace Conference theme, which is Temple of Peace, ? International Cooperation and World Order since 1945. And of course, our keynote speaker, Admiral James Stavridis. It's rare and probably a once-in-a-lifetime gig to get to introduce a man who's so widely respected for his expertise that he made the shortlist for vice presidential candidate, rather, for one campaign, and reportedly at least later met with the president-elect of the other camp to discuss a possible cabinet appointment. So I want to welcome you all to an event that began as an annual conference in fall 1988. The theme then was political violence in Central America, and as it happens, our speaker tonight could have probably talked about that in one way or another, as he at one point commanded U.S. Southcom for essentially the Americas. And we've ranged far and wide since then, and this year we landed on a topic that was particularly on the minds of Elizabeth and John Baker, which is the post-World War II world order and its challenges. My name is Ingo Trauschweitzer. I'm on the history faculty, and I'm the director of the Contemporary History Institute. As such, I get to organize the Baker Peace Conference. This year's program came together around the thought that it would be worth, I suppose, commemorating and considering the 70th anniversary of the North Atlantic Alliance. We're about a month or so, less than a month away from the 70th anniversary of the signing of the North Atlantic Treaty. Though the wider framework that we'll be considering both this evening and tomorrow is of course defined by global issues and not just simply transatlantic ones. So besides NATO, for example, the United Nations will play a significant role amongst our organizational framework. Now, before introducing tonight's speaker, I'd like to thank Ann Baker, the daughter of John Calhoun and Elizabeth Evans Baker, who provided the vision, name, and funds for the Baker Peace Studies program that underwrites this event. And Ann carries on their legacy, and I have to say I've been here for about a decade, and I've long admired your commitment to the program and to the university. And of course, Ann's once again made the trek from New York down here to join us this evening. I also want to thank a few people in the Contemporary History Institute, without whom, while life would be difficult, but the event certainly would be impossible. First and foremost, Connie Hunter, our events coordinator, and Adam Givens, a graduate assistant who's been running the propaganda campaign for this and other programs quite skillfully, and Cara Dunphy, our administrative assistant. I'd also would like to thank President Nellis for hosting a lovely dinner and for engaging in this event. So our program opens with tonight's keynote address to set the stage, introduce us to the general framework and some of the finer points of the topic at hand, and get us started thinking about this so-called liberal order that came together after World War II, the challenges to it once the Cold War emerged and started to engulf much of the world, and the state of affairs in the 21st century. You're all invited to join us tomorrow for a sequence of panels on these issues, starting at 10 a.m. And then recommencing after lunch at 1 in Nelson Commons. I'm thrilled that we have Admiral James Stavridis here this evening to guide us towards some of these questions. He's now the operating executive of the Carlyle Group, evidently the world's largest equity group, and until this past summer had been the dean of the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University, where he had, at an earlier point, earned his MA and his PhD in international finance. Stavridis is thus familiar with the business world as well as the academy, but of course invited him here because I'm a renowned champion of the Navy and of all things maritime. Admiral Stavridis has what he over dinner so charmingly called a long misspent youth. I take it 37 years of a career in the Navy, which took him to very many places and exalted commands, not the least of which being command of a carrier group in the general area, let's say, of operations enduring freedom and Iraqi freedom in the early 2000s. on to the Pentagon, where he served as the senior military aide to the Secretary of Defense, on to Southcom, which I had mentioned earlier, and then on to EUCOM, or perhaps better known as NATO, in the sense that you're both the commander of all US forces in Europe, therefore European commander, and SECURE, the Supreme Allied Commander Europe, where he followed in the footsteps, if not directly, of one Dwight Eisenhower, who held that position as the first SECURE in 1951 and 52. And apropos of nothing, I'll just say he went on to become president, but that is idle speculation. Stavridis served in the post in Belgium from 2009 to 2013, commanding US and European military assets attached to the alliance at a time when NATO was involved in the war in Afghanistan and ran peace-building missions in the Balkans and elsewhere. And so I was struck that when we're thinking about who would be good for a keynote on this theme, that we have here a speaker with such a wide range of experiences, but also someone always willing to contribute to our public discourse on strategy, on policy, on the state of the world in his books, which I think now stand at 8, in journal articles, in op-eds, television appearances, as in this morning's Morning Joe, I'm told, and public speeches. Admiral Stavridis is an advocate of combining hard and soft power, and he's certainly extremely well placed to tell us where we stand in the in 2019. So I know you all, just like me, are keen on hearing his thoughts on the 21st century, challenges and opportunities, and please join me in welcoming James Stavridis to Ohio University and to the Baker Peace Conference.
Dankeschön. Thank you, Inka. What a lovely introduction. It's wonderful to be here in the Midwest tonight. That was a very gracefully done introduction. And, when people hear that introduction, Supreme Allied Commander and all that, they generally have two reactions. One is when they actually see me, they say, "Man, I thought you'd be taller than you appear to be." There's not much I can do about that. But then they also say, "Well, Stavridis, if you're really that cool, why were you not a Navy fighter pilot? Like Goose and Maverick." The sequel is coming, by the way. And I, truth be told, I desperately wanted to be a fighter pilot, but I had a very traumatic experience when I was a young boy that made aviation difficult for me. So what we're going to do tonight is I'm going to take probably 35 minutes, maybe 40, and just kind of look around the horizon with you. We're going to look at the security challenges that are out there, and then we're going to kind of hit pause for a second and talk about what are the opportunities? How can we create security? And I think that a school like OU has a role in that. I think all of you have a role in that. And so we'll unpackage that a little bit. But let's begin with the challenges. And I'm going to start on this terrible day. So this is 9/11. Everybody knows this image of the Pentagon. What you don't know is that the little red circle was my office. So I watched the airplane hit the Pentagon. That's a sobering moment. And what occurred to me as I stumbled out of that building, while the true heroes of the day, the first responders, showed up, and I stood there amidst all that smoke and watched people loaded up into ambulances, what occurred to me was the irony of that moment as follows. Here I was, by definition, in the safest place in the world, right? I'm in the Pentagon. I'm behind massive concrete walls. I'm guarded by the strongest military on earth. I'm in the capital of the richest country on the planet Earth. Was I safe? No. And I think if you begin at that point and look at the challenges that are emerging around the world, this stands as an introductory metaphor to the dangers we face. I'm going to start with violent extremism. This, of course, is the Islamic State. And they are, if you will, terrorism 3.0. So if 1.0 is the 1980s in Europe, the Baader-Meinhof gang, Red Brigades, terrorism 2.0, Al-Qaeda, brought down the World Trade Towers, a few $100,000, 10 Saudis, crazy story. Terrorism 3.0, the Islamic State, upper right. They're a money-making machine. We've never seen a terrorist group this well-financed. And even as we push them out of their geographic control in Syria and Iraq, they will reemerge in cyber. And they will continue to proselytize, to recruit, to conduct actual operations. So as we look at any list of challenges, do not write this one off. This is not, at least as yet, mission accomplished. And they have a plan. Now, look at Spain. I don't think Spain is going to be called Andalus anytime soon. But when a group is this creative, this capable of making funds, this capable of being resilient, we ought to be concerned about them. And of course, it's not just the Islamic State. It's Al-Shabaab in Eastern Africa. It's Boko Haram in Nigeria. We're going to continue to see this kind of violent extremism across the religious and ideological spectrum. So we got to worry about that. What else? We're to be somewhat concerned about nations that live outside the norms of international law. One is Iran. Most of you will recognize the flag of Iran. Few of you will recognize the missile to the right of it. That's a Sahel-2 missile, 2,000-mile weapon. Iran will continue to push the borders of this region in green. What is this map in green? What empire is this? That's very good. These are the battle flags of Cyrus the Great and Darius the Magnificent. This is the Persian Empire. As a proud Greek American, you'll note that Greece was never conquered. The point we ought to take away is that this is the Iranian self-view. They see themselves as an imperial power. They hearken back to this series of empires that go back 2,500 years. And they will continue to press against the edges of the Sunni Arab world. So this is a dangerous situation in world history, right? This is religious conflict, Shia, Sunni, with a geopolitical overlay. Iran, Saudi Arabia, competing blocs. Where have we seen that movie before? The Wars of the Reformation in Europe, when Catholics and Protestants, religion, go to war geopolitically. England, Spain. Ground Zero, the Netherlands, just a short distance from my headquarters in Belgium, was the fault point. Those streams, when they cross in human history, religion, religious conflict, and geopolitics, it's like in the movie Ghostbuster. You never want the streams to cross, because when they do, they create prolonged wars. Parked in the middle of it is Israel, and a highly catalytic actor in MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, lower left, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia. This is a combustible situation in the Middle East. And of course, part of it is a humanitarian disaster. Syria, this is Bashar al-Assad, the dictator and war criminal of Syria. He has killed 600,000 in this civil war, and he has pushed 7 million people outside the borders of Syria. Pre-war population, 21 million. 7 million displaced outside the country, 7 million displaced inside the country, 600,000 dead. And it has created great power competition, much as the Balkans created a theater for great power competition in the early part of the 20th century. This theater, the Eastern Mediterranean, has become a point of contention between the US and Russia. And what does it all lead to? Right there. Waves of refugees, which have roiled the politics of Europe. And who's the big winner in all this? Our friend, Vladimir Putin, who is a very clever tactician. He's a bad strategist. I'll come to that in a moment. But he's a very clever tactician, and he is using all of this in the Middle East to allow him to do what he wants in Ukraine, which he has invaded. And you know, I can show you this benign-looking map, and most of you will know that the Crimea, that little dongle hanging down, was annexed by Russia. But let me show you what Ukraine actually looks like. Photographs taken 2 weeks ago. It's a war, folks. 15,000 dead, territory annexed, an occupation of southeastern Ukraine. And our problem in solving this is that we keep looking for the strategic terrain on this map, right? Here's the strategic terrain. It's right there. It's the mind of Vladimir Putin. So this Middle East challenge can be tied to events that are unfolding in Europe as well. Let's bring it a little closer to home. This is getting ready to blow in a big way, and we're not paying attention, not sufficient attention in my view. There is no military solution here, but the numbers are starting to approach Syria. There are 30 million people pre-conflict population in Venezuela. There are 4 million Venezuelans out of the country, almost 5 million. And that's going to get worse before it gets better. Most of you will recognize Juan Guaido and Nicolas Maduro, and they are locked in a death struggle, and only one of them is going to come out of this. So even here in our region, in the Americas, we see this kind of national tension manifesting itself. All of that is before we get to Asia, right? So if I'm going to recommend one book for you to read about Asia, I'd recommend this. Robert Kaplan's Asia's Cauldron. And if there's one photograph that thematically defines it, it's right here. It's the rise of Chinese maritime power. These are Chinese ballistic missile submarines. And China has a plan, and it's a good plan. It's a smart plan. It's called One Belt, One Road. It's essentially a mercantile zone of influence that runs from China through the South China Sea, to the Straits of Malacca, Indian Ocean, and thence to Africa and north into Europe itself. It's a clever plan, so let's zone in. And what they really want is right here, the South China Sea. This is a big body of water, folks. This is the size of the Gulf of Mexico and the Caribbean Sea combined. China claims it as territorial seas. This would be as though the United States woke up on a Tuesday morning and said, you know what? We've got historical claim to this part of the world. We will own it. It is a preposterous claim, and it's going to be ground zero in a competition, and let's hope it stays as a competition and not a conflict between the United States and China. And again, I can show you a map. Let me show you what the South China Sea actually looks like. It's artificial islands. The Chinese are building and militarizing massive, large structures, sand islands with airstrips, missiles, tanks, troops. Why are they doing that? If you're an international lawyer, you know that every spot of land that pokes above the sea has a 12-mile territorial sea, a 24-mile contiguous zone, and a 200-mile exclusive economic zone. You build enough of these and you connect the dots, and you build a case in international law to control this. And the reason they want this, it's the beating heart of One Belt, One Road. Why? Because there are billions of barrels of oil and trillions of cubic feet of natural gas, and because 40% of the world's trade moves through here. So China is playing this long game. They're also not only physically doing it at sea, they're in the cyber seas. They're working hard to control 5G, the next big network. And in a pretty clever move, they're getting very close with Vladimir Putin. These are Chinese and Russian troops who are working together in exercises, not only on the Siberian border where you'd kind of expect them, but Chinese and Russian ships are operating together in the Baltic Sea today. Now, remember my comment that Vladimir Putin, good tactician, bad strategist? This is a good example of it. This is pretty good tactics by Putin, but think about this strategically. Here's Russia, massive landmass, right? Largest land country in the world, and it's got a problem. Its population is maldistributed. Almost everybody lives to the west of the Ural Mountains. In an area to the east of the Ural Mountains, from the Pacific and Siberia to the Ural Mountains, that's the size of the United States of America. How many Russians live there? 19 million. The population of the greater New York area in that massive landmass. And it's full of timber, gold, rare earths, diamonds, water. The Chinese look at it like my dog looks at a ribeye steak. It looks really good. Good tactics, not a good strategy for Russia. Now, that brings us to a problem which is called Kim Jong-un. And he's... Okay. By the way, since we just hit pause with that bell, is there any way to make it cooler in this room? Because I see a lot of people fanning themselves. Can we crack the doors open? Can we be creative? I bet if we cracked open those doors, just put a book on the bottom of them, you get a little flow through here. Be a nice thing. Kim Jong-un. He's well named. He's unpredictable. He's also morbidly obese. He's addicted to opioids. He's got a really bad haircut. And here's the bad news. He is perfectly capable of taking some number of his 50 nuclear weapons and delivering them at range. And that ought to worry us greatly. Here's the good news. This is a problem on the Korean Peninsula where the US and China could work together to solve a problem. So watch for the summit in Mar-a-Lago just a couple of weeks from now. Trump and Xi, they will make a big, beautiful trade deal. It'll be huge. But the thing to watch is what comes out about North Korea, because this is an area in which US and Chinese interests actually converge. And we ought to remember, by the way, even if we solve the nuclear problem, if we can somehow convince him to give up his nukes, I think it's unlikely, we'll see, he's still got the 5th largest standing army in the world and massive stocks of chemical and biological weapons. So we ought to be concerned, and the Chinese ought to be concerned, and both sides are. And this is an area in which our interests converge more than they diverge. So, to conclude on the Pacific, I am cautiously optimistic about US-Chinese relations. I am pessimistic about where the Middle East is going. So with that as kind of backdrop of violent extremism, terrorism, and national kinds of concerns, let's shift and talk about transnational concerns. What crop is this? Poppies, heroin, opium. This is Afghanistan. 90% of the world's opium comes from there. This is a massive flow of narcotics. Today there are perhaps a global economy about 80 trillion, probably close to $1 trillion in illicit narcotics that move. And it's not just poppy and heroin, it's cocaine coming from the Americas. And let me just park that idea of whether or not you should use cocaine or marijuana. I'm actually leaning in the direction of legalization for a variety of reasons, principally because of my libertarian view that people ought to do what they want. But what I worry about with this is the money the profits, which go to undermine fragile democracies. They engage in corruption. They undermine so many societies. This particular photograph is actually it's a very hopeful photograph. This is a drug bust. This is a high-tech U.S. Navy vessel capturing a drug runner. Here's the bad news. The high-tech U.S. Navy vessel is the one on top. The one on the bottom that looks like Batman's submarine, that was built in the jungle of Colombia by the cartels. And when we caught this thing, and Truth in Advertising, there's a Navy destroyer just outside the picture. When we caught this thing, it had 10 tons of cocaine in it. 10 tons. Street value in New York City, $150 million. Here are the numbers. To build this thing cost $2 million. Crew, bribes, another $2 million. That's $4 million. Cost of the coke, about $5 million. That's $9 million in, $150 million out. That's margin. That's profit. If you went to business school, that's EBITDA. That's what we ought to worry about with narcotics. So in addition to violent extremism, terrorism, international actors, nation states, transnational, we also ought to worry about Mother Nature. Top, Ebola. Bottom, Zika. We're doing okay dealing with those two. They ought to ring a bell for us. They ought to ring a bell that hit about 100 years ago. What happened in 1918? Spanish influenza, Spanish flu. 40% of the world's population infected, 20% mortality rate. Think about that. And you would say to yourself, yeah, but okay, we're so much further along, we have all these medical advances. Look at human history and the propensity for pandemics to emerge despite all the medical advancements. And by the way, today's highly globalized society, you could double those numbers of Spanish influenza if people were in and out of airports constantly, like we are today. So we had to worry about this. And I would argue global warming, climate, here's a news flash tonight, it's real. It's happening, folks. And to me, this isn't even a debatable point. For me as a mariner, I've spent my life on the oceans. Here's a fact. It's an indisputable fact. The ice is melting. It's melting in the high north and it's melting in the Antarctic. And when it does that, it's like in your bathtub. If you have lots of ice in your bathtub and it melts, what happens to the water level? Goes up. You don't have to be a physicist to answer that question. It goes up. And islands get swamped and ports get ended. And worse, the fundamental chemistry and temperature of the oceans change. And here's newsflash number 2. The oxygen you are breathing does not come principally from trees and forests and photosynthesis on land. That's about 30% of the oxygen you're breathing. 70% of the oxygen you breathe comes from photosynthesis in the ocean. With all due respect for Al Gore, the Amazon are not the lungs of the earth. The lungs of the earth are the oceans. That's the biggest long-term challenge we face, in my view. So Mother Nature, both pandemics and climate. Well, let me wrap up this tale of woe, talk about some things that are working. But I want to conclude by answering the question, well, what really kept you awake at night, Admiral, when you were the NATO commander? That's a lot of problems. And you know what? The thing that kept me awake at night was none of those things, because I felt like we're kind of moving in the right direction. Back in those days, by the way, we were signing the Paris Climate Accords, pulling out of that, major mistake. We'll be back in that before this decade is over. But the thing that kept me awake at night was cyber security. These are the flags of Ukraine, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Georgia, a small republic in the Caucasus. What they have in common is that all of them have undergone a cyber attack from Russia in the last 7 years. Georgia, right there, that little flag with all the crosses on it, Georgia will go down in military history, we have a room full of military historians here, as the first nation to be simultaneously attacked kinetically, rockets, bombs, troops, tanks, end with cyber. Every other war that ever happens in human history will manifest both of those. Georgia was the first. And cyber, we are quite vulnerable here in the United States, our grid in particular. And I'll illustrate that by, if I may, with a tale of two scientists. So imagine I could just snap my fingers and bring back to life a scientist. And I'm going to choose to bring back Alexander Graham Bell. What did he invent? The telephone. Ma Bell, right? So he invented the telephone. And I would bring back Dr. Bell, put him on the stage, and I'd say, Dr. Bell, this is the result of your invention. This is a telephone, except it has no wires. It can communicate point to point anywhere in the world. It can access all the world's knowledge. It can play any symphony ever recorded. It can show movies. It can take photographs with unbelievable precision. It can measure distance. Alexander Graham Bell would look at that like my basset hound looks at a wristwatch. It just wouldn't make any sense. On the other hand, I could snap my fingers and I could bring back Thomas Alva Edison. What did he invent? The light bulb, correct. His bigger invention was he created the grid. He built the first grid. It was on a city block in New York City. Technically speaking, he discovered that you can run electricity in parallel. That's what creates grids. So if I brought Thomas Alva Edison back and I said, let me show you what the grid looks like today, and I rolled it out in front of him, he would go, okay, generator, transformer, station, substation, wires, transformer, load. Yeah, I can help you with that. I can fix that. Think about that. The point is, we have invested enormously here, but we have not done a commensurate level of change to protect and advance the electrical grid. If you want to read one book about it, check out The Grid by Gretchen Bakke. And by the way, cyber is so dangerous, not because it's only big nations attacking other big nations, it's also small nations who can attack big nations. It's an equalizer. What flag is this? North Korea. So this movie comes out. Anybody actually see this movie? The Interview? It is terrible. It's possibly the worst movie I've ever seen. I highly do not recommend it. But it's a movie about a kind of a slapstick comic plot against Kim Jong-un. It's got two hapless CIA agents in it. And it's harmless, except if you're Kim Jong-un, because it mocked him and it made him feel small and diminished. And he responded. And he launched cyber attacks against Sony Pictures, an American corporation. Did $200 million worth of kinetic damage to their IT networks and incalculable business damage when he dumped all of their racist, misogynist emails into the wild. So cyber is not only big national risk from big nations, it's also small nations can use it to equalize. Iran, very good at this. And lastly on cyber, and why I worry about it so much, is cyber is personal. Who is this? Jennifer Lawrence, beautiful young Academy Award-winning actress. Several years ago, she took some, shall we say, intimate photographs of herself, intended for her significant other, two consenting adults, no big deal. Unfortunately, she posted them in an account which was hacked. Those photographs were then distributed and went viral. That's a crime. It's a sex crime. The perpetrator was apprehended and is incarcerated. That's a good thing. The photos are forever, and they are viral. And I tell that story to make the point that only cyber goes from the highest levels of our national security through our banking and finance systems to the most intimate details of our lives. I invite you to consider what's on that supercomputer you are carrying around with you, or your children if you're my age. So cyber, I think, has first place among some very dangerous kinds of things as we think about this 21st century. All of this has a strategic context. Our greatest pool of partners, the European Union, are being pulled apart by centrifugal forces, Brexit principally. And what's our problem here? Gridlock. Our political parties can't work together. We cannot disagree without being extremely disagreeable. We have lost the ability to find our way to sensible compromise. That may be the biggest challenge of all. So right about now, you ought to say, phew, okay, Admiral, I'm concerned. What should we do? How can we create security? What are the best means to do that? What makes us secure? And you're thinking, okay, next picture, he's an admiral. This is going to be an aircraft carrier. No. I think the number one thing we can do to create security is this. We can listen better. We can listen better. This, by the way, is not Photoshop. This is an actual Belgian air defense system from the 1930s. He's listening for incoming aircraft. It's quite innovative if you think about it. I put it here as metaphor. We should listen more to each other in our society. We should listen to our allies, partners, and friends. We should spend perhaps a little less time yelling at the North Koreans and more time listening to the South Koreans, who understand Kim Jong-un in ways we will never comprehend. And most difficult, we need to listen to our opponents, both in domestic politics, but also internationally. We need to listen to China and understand why they think they can make a plausible claim to the territoriality of the South China Sea. I don't agree with it, but let's listen to them. We ought to understand why Russia thinks Crimea is historically part of the Russian Federation. We ought to listen to that argument. We ought to confront it. But we can't do that until we at least listen to it. So I'd put that actually at the top of my list. What else can we do? We can do what you do here at this spectacular university at OU. This is the Naval College in Newport, Rhode Island, where the Navy sends its top people, men and women, officer and enlisted, to do exactly what you are doing now, to take a break and build some intellectual capital. That is a powerful means to create security. What else can we do? We can own our own education. And here I speak to the students in the room. You are so lucky now because you are part of a system that in a very serious and refined way is moving you through an educational process. Here's the third news flash of the night. When you graduate, you own it. You own that education, and you need to continue it. And that means studying languages and night courses. It means taking an online MOOC from time to time. And above all, it means reading. Reading, and continue that education. Education, along with listening better and building intellectual capital, is foundational to creating security. Here's some books that I would recommend. I'm sorry for that podium there. Like War, Peter Singer's book about the weaponization of social networks just came out. Terrific. Peddling Protectionism, the effect of the Hawley-Smoot tariffs on the global economy. And Robert Kagan's new book, The Jungle Grows Back, about what happens when the United States simply disengages from the world. So you should be reading nonfiction, but I would argue, read a few novels. Read a few novels. Only through fiction can you insert yourself in another time, another place, another gender. Only through fiction can you understand what it's like to be involved in the momentous decisions. I was having a conversation with a young grad student who gave me a ride here, Harrison Fender, and he was telling me about his study of sea power and the history of navies. And I thought it was a terrific conversation, and I recommended he also read a few novels to understand what it's like to be a sea captain on the edge of battle. What's it like to be an admiral making command decisions? You want to understand Latin America, read Isabel Allende's book, Ineza My Soul, which is about the woman in the 15th century who founds modern Chile. Only fiction can be that laboratory, that simulator that puts you in an entirely different place. It shouldn't be the only thing in your diet, but it ought to find a place along with education. What else? We can hold on to our values, folks. What are our values? Democracy, liberty, freedom of speech, freedom of education, gender equality, racial equality. We execute them imperfectly, admittedly, but they are the right values. And they come to us from the ancient Greeks, from the East. They come to us through the Enlightenment, that's the young Voltaire, through our founding fathers, and you can drop a plumb line to principled leaders like Angela Merkel of Germany. We need to hold on to those values and not back away from them. And how about our country? How about the United States of America? What's our role in creating security? I am not a triumphalist about the United States. I do not think that we are the indispensable nation. I just don't believe that. On the other hand, I am not a declinist. I do not think the United States is moving toward irrelevancy. We are somewhere in the middle. And the reason we still matter, upper left, political impact. Look at those two photographs. Regardless of how you feel about the previous president or the current president, when an American president speaks, other global leaders listen. Upper left, the G20, top is the G20, bottom is the G8. Political impact. Upper right, our economy has many flaws, debt and deficit, but as a hand of cards, the innovation, the size, the throw weight, any other nation would trade places with us. Bottom right, as Americans, you must know you have the most capable military, but also an apolitical military. That is crucial. Bottom left, we're a young nation. Newsflash, number 4, immigration helps us. Do we need to control our borders? Sure. But immigration is the engine of America. And what's that in the middle? Fracking tower. Got to do it right, environmentally sound. I've studied the science of this. I think we can do this. When you put it alongside sustainables, gas, fracking, our own reserves, the United States is on its way to energy independence. That's a powerful suite. So who are our partners and allies? And this, I think, is what the conference will unpackage over the next couple of days. Naturally, as a former NATO commander, I'm going to tell you NATO. But I think that we're going to see even less structured arrangements, coalitions. This is the coalition against the Islamic State. 77 nations are in this. And I would argue in this 21st century, there is a potential partner of enormous magnitude that we are only now beginning to focus on. Not NATO, not a traditional ally. It's India. This is the Golden Temple of Amritsar, sacred to the Sikh faith. India, as the 21st century unspools, by the end of this century, my view, will have more impact than China because of demographics. Its population is young and rising. And because it's a democracy, it has a safety valve that allows it to lift and reduce internal pressures. Those are powerful advantages it has over China. As a partner for the United States, India will matter a lot. What else creates security? Okay, there's the picture of the aircraft carrier. Yeah, we need a capable military. But I would argue your military is going to look a little different. It's another terrible movie. It's a very good novel, actually. It's a novel about leadership. But it's a movie about cyber and cybersecurity and the creation of a young cybersecurity force. You are going to continue to see some of these big platforms, but you're also going to see cyber, unmanned, artificial intelligence. All of that will be part of creating security. And yet the fundamental thing will never change. And that's this. It's the young men and women who volunteer to defend us. Let me introduce you to Lieutenant Michael Murphy, Navy SEAL officer, graduate of Penn State University, died in 2008 in Afghanistan, where he led a SEAL mission that went terribly wrong. He made an incredibly ethical and moral decision that cost him and 3 of his shipmates their lives. This is a story that is told beautifully in a film called Lone Survivor, or a book by the same name. I put Michael Murphy here to remind us that for all the high-tech, really cool, expensive stuff and the cyber and the traditional platforms, at the end of the day, none of that means anything without young men and women like Michael Murphy. And by the way, his spirit sails on in that Navy destroyer named for him. Your military will also do more soft power kinds of things. This is the hospital ship Comfort. I deployed it several times when I was commander of Southern Command. And I'll tell you a story about Comfort. We sent her down to Nicaragua. She pulled into Corinto Harbor, which the United States mined in the 1980s. And we set up clinics all over the city. And at the eye clinic, a young mother came to the clinic with her son. And she said to the doctor, "My son can't see anything in the distance. His eyes are horrible." And so the doctor very quickly diagnosed the little boy, and she put a little pair of like tester glasses on the little boy. And he suddenly looked up, and the clinic was set up like in a park. And he looked up, and you could tell he could see every leaf on the tree. Everything suddenly was clear. And he said, "Mama, veo el mundo." Mom, I see the world. Multiply that times 400,000 patient treatments. That creates security because it portrays a very different face to the United States and our military. And you'll see this kind of thing. This is Afghanistan. And these are Afghan troops. And as you can see, they're reading books. And you ought to say, well, you know, that's strange, Admiral, because I thought I read somewhere that Afghans in this demographic were largely illiterate. They couldn't read. That's correct. The Taliban withheld formal education from Afghans who are now in their early 30s. Okay, so why are these particular Afghans reading? The answer is this is literacy training. We are teaching them to read. We have taught 800,000 Afghans to read and write. Let me tell you something about Afghanistan. If you can read in Afghanistan, you put a pen in your pocket like this so other people can see it. Well, I'm a literate person. When they graduate from this course, 6-month course, at the graduation ceremony, we give them a pen. You should see the look on their face when they put that pen in their pocket. This may be the most lasting thing we do in Afghanistan. Are there guns in that picture? Yeah, we're teaching them to fight. They've still got a tough challenge ahead. I think we're closing in on a diplomatic, political solution in Afghanistan, led by an Afghan-American named Zal Khalilzad, who is a perfect example of why immigration helps us. If he didn't exist, we'd have to invent him to solve this problem. The point is, your military will do more of this soft power as well as being very capable of this hard power piece as well. All of that helps create security. So let me wrap it up and then we'll open it up for a conversation. I'm going to close by saying we've got to be in this world to create security, right? So you're looking at that and you're thinking, okay, retired admiral, these must be shipping lanes. Nope. Maybe airline routes? Nope. Maybe fiber optic cables under the water? Nope. Too many. Only 300 cables carry all of the internet. It's a real vulnerability, by the way. So what is this? It's Facebook. The brighter the white, the higher the concentration of Facebook users. If you're a poker player, the tell is that China is dark. China holds all that data on the social networks. Data, by the way, is the new oil. The more you have, the faster you can conduct machine learning, which drives artificial intelligence. Again, a clever Chinese strategy. But I put this here for us in the context of strategic communication. We have to utilize these social networks to move our values. Democracy, freedom of speech, gender equality, racial equality. Because here's the bad news. I'm showing you also the command and control network of the Islamic State. They use these networks, Pete Singer's book, The Weaponization of Social Networks, like war. They use these networks to proselytize, to recruit, to conduct operations. We have to get into this world. And I say this to smart people, and they say, yeah, Admiral, I get it. You know, it's like it's a war of ideas. No, it's not a war of ideas. It's a marketplace of ideas. We have to compete. We cannot enter this with the arrogance that everyone will ascribe to our values simply because we proclaim them. We have to compete in this marketplace. And by the way, it's not just doing it at scale. There are 2.2 billion people on Facebook, by the way. You got to do it retail. You got to do it one-on-one. This is me as the NATO commander, Supreme Allied Commander of NATO. I'm with my opposite number, the Supreme Commander of the Russian Armed Forces, General Nikolai Makarov. Just as an aside, I always had a lot of affection for General Makarov because he's a man of normal height, as you can see. In fact, we were having this meeting, and when it was over, my boss, Secretary of Defense Robert Gates, best boss I ever had, Secretary Gates called me up and said, Stavridis, how did the meeting go? And I said, sir, it was great. We saw everything eye to eye. The point is, you got to be able to move ideas at scale, but personal contact still matters deeply. You got to be able to do both. Okay, last slide or two. So, I have talked a lot tonight about what might be called soft power, right? Listening better, education, building intellectual capital, reading books, hospitalships, literacy training, strategic communication. I believe in all that. That's soft power. This is a Tomahawk missile. This is hard power. This thing will go 1,500 miles. It would destroy this building. And it is perfectly capable of being programmed to fly through that door or that door. We are very good at this. I would not want anybody to leave here tonight with the slightest shred of doubt about your military's ability to use hard power. But in the end, you need hard power infrequently. You need it to go after the Islamic State. You're not going to negotiate a solution with the Islamic State. You're going to find them and terminate them with extreme prejudice. But the way to think about it is here. There are times when you need that hard power, but so often the long game is on that soft power side. The bottom line is that you need both soft power and hard power. Collectively, that's smart power, as some have called it. Last slide. I love this picture. This was taken 5 years ago. It was the AP Photo of the Year, selected from 100,000 photographs. It's a group of Somali refugees. They're standing on a beach on the Red Sea. And what are they doing prosaically? They're holding up their flip phones. They're trying to get a better cell signal. Last news flash, that doesn't help. That's what they're doing prosaically. What are they doing metaphorically in this picture? They're reaching for the light. They're trying to get to the next stage of their journey. This is a photo of hope. So I'm going to wrap with a quote. And if you remember nothing else from our evening together, I hope you remember this quote. It's a quote from Napoleon. I always like to quote Napoleon because short people have to stick together at all times. It's a tough world out there. Napoleon said, "A leader is a dealer in hope." A leader is a dealer in hope. There are times when you need hard power. The long game is on that soft power side. You need both. In the end, you need hope. So all of you are leaders or will be leaders. As leaders, be a dealer in hope. Thank you very much. Pleasure being with you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Okay, let's open it up for a few minutes of questions or comments or answers on what we talked about or anything else. To whom can I? Yes, sir. Just keep the mic with me. Just keep the mic with me, whoever is taking it away. Go ahead.
At dinner tonight, you indicated that as a human rights lawyer and historian, I should go and see Guantanamo.
Mm-hmm.
Most partly because I'm the only human rights lawyer I know who hasn't been there.
Yeah.
What would I see there
Sure.
that would help me with my projects? And do you take into account when you were commanding that southern zone the soft power hit that a country like
course.
the United States takes from a space like that?
I do. So to get everyone on the same sheet of music, Guantanamo Bay is a small Navy base on the southern tip of the island state of Cuba. And after the immediate moment of 9/11, everybody we kind of scooped up in a series of raids were sent there. And we ended up at one time with about 900 prisoners there. And as the professor correctly indicates, it became this international symbol of inhumanitarian and violations of international law, because initially the prisoners there were not kept in, shall we say, fully legitimate conditions. I came into this problem at about the point where we had 600 prisoners still there. Working with national authorities, we were able to gradually reduce that population. We have 38 prisoners there today. We have either released them, some of whom have gone back to the battlefield, some of whom are now leading productive lives. We have moved them to the disciplinary and judicial systems of other nations. So we are gradually moving out of that phase. To answer the question, what would you see? The other thing that we did in the mid-2000s was bring the International Committee of the Red Cross, the ICRC, to conduct monthly inspections. We also opened the prisons to journalists, academics. I am surprised as a lawyer of international and human relations, you haven't been there. We opened it to the Congress. We've had 1,000 congressional visits to the prison. It is, without question, the most inspected prison on the planet Earth. And it's really, I think, moved from being a very negative symbol to being kind of a small, almost forgotten and neutral signal. Having said all that, my recommendation would be to close the detention facility, take the 38 prisoners, put them in Supermax in Colorado. I think the remaining prisoners there are indeed too dangerous to release. I mean, this includes the killer who beheaded Danny Pearl, the Wall Street Journal lawyer. It includes some of the fundamental 9/11 perpetrators. These are not people we can release. They ought to be incarcerated. But the idea of the strategic communication and how you mitigate it is to open it, put transparency on it, and close it as soon as you can. And I would argue that moment has come. Thank you. Great question. Yes, sir, Professor.
You evaluated President Putin as a strategist and a tactician. There was one name that I expected to hear tonight and I didn't hear,
Okay.
and that's Putin's counterpart. So you care to
That's
comment-
President Xi.
care to comment on President Trump as
Sure.
a strategist, tactician, or does that even matter?
Sure, I can, of course. I think that the way to think about President Trump, my view, is to kind of put it in three buckets, okay? There is his moral and ethical characteristics, which I think most of us would say are highly negative. Without question, he pays off porn stars. He has an extremely loose relationship with the truth. Those are ethical and moral failures of President Trump. And I think they're kind of indisputable. Even his strongest supporters will not dispute them. They'll simply say, well, those aren't important to me. So there's a bucket. Second bucket, which is unfolding in front of us on national television, his legal challenges. It's kind of different, but kind of related, but it's a second bucket. So my view, I trust and respect Mueller. And I think the report, when I see it, and I want to see the whole report, I'll then form a judgment on that legal basket. And by the way, those legal problems, as I think most who follow this know, are now simply going to devolve to state courts, and he will have a continuing series of legal challenges he's got to deal with. Third bucket, policy. I think, and here I get to answer your question, tactics, strategy. He's not a strategist. I don't think he himself wouldn't describe himself as a strategist. He would say he's a tactician. He kind of goes with his gut. I would say of the tactical things I've seen him do, the policy things, there are some things I agree with and some things I disagree with. I'll give you some I agree with. I agree with his pivot away from fire and fury, and I'm going to take us into a war on the Korean Peninsula, to pursuing a diplomatic resolution. I could be very critical of the exact format of doing that, but the macro turn to get away from B-2 bombers to sitting at a table, I think that's good. I think that he has done a reasonable job landing a new NAFTA, it's now USMCA. He kind of tweaked it around the edges. It's not a terrible agreement. It's moved some things forward, I think, reasonably well. I think the administration is doing a reasonable job on Venezuela, which is to say they're not reflexively reaching for a military instrument. They understand the strategic negatives of deploying U.S. troops in Latin America and the Caribbean, but yet they're putting a lot of pressure on. I think taking a reasonably tough stance toward China on tariffs and artificial intelligence and cyber is a good move. I think we want to bend that relationship, but we don't want to break it. We'll know more about that in a few weeks. I think those are some things I could generally agree with. I violently disagree with walking away from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which would have been the largest free trade zone in human history, and I think would have helped us put pressure on China. I violently disagree with walking away from the Paris Climate Accords, because I think that is a legitimate national security imperative. I disagree with the tone the president takes with our European allies, and I disagree with his strangely friendly tone toward Vladimir Putin. I think he's kind of got that one backwards. So, bottom line, we could walk through every single thing he's done. I don't see him as a strategist. I see him as an instinct-driven tactician. He has done some things I agree with. He's done probably a few more I disagree with. And I'll conclude, because I want to make a point, which is I am nonpartisan. I'm a registered independent. I always have been. I have voted on both sides. I have never endorsed a political candidate. I was vetted for vice president by Hillary Clinton. I was one of 6 formally vetted. And then I was offered a cabinet post by Donald Trump. I think of that as 2 bullets whizzing by my head. I mention it in the context that I'm a centrist. I'm a radical centrist. I want to find a way for a larger percentage of our population to come together on issues, and I think we can find our way there. I think it will be more difficult with our current set of actors. And I think, I'll close with this because it's a very controversial thought, but I think, and we're in a room full of historians, I think we are due for a new political party in the United States. We act as though somewhere in the Constitution it says we will have Republicans and Democrats. Doesn't say that, as all of you know. And in fact, we started with Whigs and Federalists and Nationalists. We've had progressives and Bull Moose, kind of the same. We've had a lot of political parties. And I think that to break our current cycle, we need a charismatic figure to create a new political party. Stay tuned. I think that is the way forward for this country. Others? Yeah, all the way in the back. Yes, ma'am.
Okay, I'd like to push back a little bit.
Fire away.
Okay. There's too much of this. Immigration is great, no problem. And I'm not just talking about.
Sure.
I'm not just talking about the border security.
You're not talking about border security?
I'm not only talking about. In fact, that's not my main.
Okay.
My main point. I accept that America will always have some immigration.
Mm-hmm.
But I agree with the people who have been saying now for well over 30, maybe 40 years, current levels are too high. The skills level and educational level is too low relative to what our economy needs now.
Mm-hmm.
For Europe more than the United States, there is now a problem with immigration being demographically skewed. Young males tend to cause problems regardless.
Mm-hmm.
When you have too many young males.
Great. What is your what is your question?
Okay. And that might be. We don't have that specific problem, but there is an issue with now it takes the form of the sanctuary city movement of sort of.
Do you have a question?
This is my pushback. Because people who say they want overall less, and they want higher skill levels,
Mm-hmm.
and they don't want sort of something like sanctuary cities and or too many young males,
Okay.
are not anti-immigrant.
Okay.
They're saying they want a more measured, higher quality in terms of law-abiding and the skills that can be.
Okay.
And until we see real wages rise in a sustained manner in this country, sort of a slowdown of the meltdown, whatever you want to call it, the decline of the lower middle class.
Let me help you round this into a question. So you'd like my reaction to that. Thank you. I'll give you one. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. I think that you're making some valid points, and I agree completely that the degree to which we can have immigrants with higher skill sets is absolutely a plus. The degree to which we can have immigrants who have a predisposition for assimilation in our society is a powerful plus for the United States that I agree with you completely is not enjoyed in Europe, which sees a very different set of demographics. I think there's a common ground we can find our way to here, which is that, again, as I said, we need to control our border. We should not have uncontrolled borders through which anybody can flow. We can get offline and have a conversation about sanctuary cities. That's a politically charged term that I don't think has practical relevance. But I think we can agree, control the borders. I think we can agree we want skilled people. I think we can agree we want to use cyber and intelligence to vet people as they come across. I hope we can agree that we want to abide by norms of international law. That means that when people come to the United States and request asylum, we have a judicial process that's rational and makes a judgment on that. I hope we can agree on that. But in any event, without question, I would say to you, the kind of conversation we're having right now is what evidently we can't have in the Congress of the United States, which is, I can accept some of your points, I'm sure you can accept some of mine. Let's figure out a practical set of solutions that address what we have to say here. So thank you for raising those points. Others? Yes, sir, Professor Klaus.
Thank you for your remarks. There's a lot of concern in Europe about the US striking a deal with both China and perhaps with Russia in the future. And of course, I think you would agree that we do need to engage with China and Putin in a more constructive way than we do right now. But how can we do that in practical terms without antagonizing the Europeans or other allies, which I strongly believe the United States still needs in the future?
Yeah, I hope if there's one lesson that comes out of this, it's the value of our allies, partners, and friends. And I really do put Europe at the very top of that list. It's where our values come from. It's the largest economic zone in the world when you put the European Union together, larger than the United States, far larger than China. And I think step one is US, European Union work together to solve this common set of challenges. I think step two is actually India. Let's do everything we can to pull India, a fellow democracy, into this mix. Step three, we need to confront Russia where we must. Syria, cyber intrusion into our elections, Ukraine. Confront where we must, but cooperate wherever we can. We should cooperate on counter-narcotics, counterintelligence, counter-piracy, the Arctic, find our way back to strategic arms control. Confront where we must, cooperate where we can. That's Russia. China is very different. China is a strategic competition. We've seen this probably 16 times in human history, going back to the ancient Greeks, Athens, Sparta. You can look at this as Graham Allison of Harvard has done. Each time there's been a established power confronted by a rising power, 16 instances, 12 of them have resulted in global war. Last time, 100 years ago, Germany, rising power, confronts Great Britain, established power. World War I, arguably World War II falls out of that. We need to avoid that. So the fifth and final thing I would say is, how do we find ways that we can move closer with China? And that's why I think, back to steps 1 and 2, is getting Europe and India working together as we negotiate with China would be a powerful step. So I think what we'll see at Mar-a-Lago is the president cut a tactical deal. The strategic deal we want to cut has got to include Europe and, I would argue, India. Let me grab someone on this side of the room. Yes, ma'am.
You talk significantly about many areas of the world, but I'm not hearing very much about the lesser developed countries of
Sure.
Latin America and Africa. You talk about Venezuela and U.S. Policy there, but what do you think the U.S. should do in terms of the rest of Latin America and in terms of Africa in the coming years?
I think Latin America, we need to begin by shifting the lens through which we see this world to the south. And we need to understand that the Americas is a unitary world in so many ways. And, you know, we've kind of, I say this kind of with my tongue in cheek, but we've kind of appropriated that term, right? American. You know, like Lee Greenwood's song, I'm proud to be an American. Wait a minute. A Canadian is an American. They're of the Americas. A Mexican is an American. A Chilean is an American. A Haitian is an American. We're all of the Americas. We ought to think more coherently about this zone. Number two, we ought to recognize, to this lady's comments, we got to look at why are all these people trying to come to the United States. We can alleviate a lot of that and really control our borders best and in the most economical way by working with these nations to the south. And that means economic assistance in modest amounts and engaging and, I would argue, creating a free trade zone in the Americas. So I think that's the next logical step there. And I want to make a point also about foreign assistance and the military and diplomacy. And I want you all of you go see doctors, right? Everybody here goes and sees a doctor every now and again. Here's a way to think about defense spending, diplomacy, what our diplomats do in an embassy, and foreign aid, development. Because you asked, what are we doing in development? Military, in a medical sense, that's surgery. It's very painful. It's unbelievably expensive. The outcomes are somewhat unpredictable. You really don't want surgery unless you absolutely have to. Diplomacy, what our diplomats do in an embassy, that's like going to the clinic. You know, you've got a pain, you go see the doctor, she says, well, take some Motrin and do these kind of exercises. You know, it's somewhat costly. You've got to deal with professionals, but you can generally correct it without surgery, right? Development, foreign aid, economic engagement. That's preventative medicine. That's taking a statin. That's taking half a baby aspirin. That's working out. That's eating more vegetables. That's eating less red meat. How much does that cost? Nothing comparatively. The cost is all over here. And if you don't want to do the preventative medicine, stay with me here, you don't want to do the preventative medicine, and you don't even want to go to the clinic, you're going to end up over here in the surgery column, right? We all know that. So my point is, spend a few bucks over here on the preventative side, your point, development, and I would argue free trade could be a big, powerful part of this. Spend a little bit more on the diplomacy side. And yeah, sometimes you got to have surgery. It's going to hurt. It's going to be expensive. But I think that helps understand why I think the case can be made, particularly in the Americas, for the development piece. Africa, huge, expansive population. I would like to see the United States very engaged in the Americas, and I would like to see the Europeans very engaged in Africa. They have deep former colonial roots there. The French actually do this reasonably well. I think collectively, if the Europeans were more engaged there, and that doesn't mean the United States won't be there, the Europeans won't be in Latin America, but just as a zone for the two United States and European Union to focus to the south, I think is a logical way to go. It's crucial we do that because guess who's coming? China. And they are moving very aggressively in this space. So I think we need to do both. I think we got time for one more. All the way in the back. Yes, sir. Yeah.
So Germany recently, one of our main NATO allies, has rebuffed us in two ways, both on military spending as well on the 5G issue.
Right.
And other NATO.
And on Iran. And on Iran.
Yes. Have made sort of trade overtures with rights of Italy. Their government recently has made sort of trade overtures to the
Yep.
initiative you mentioned. So as our sort of relative leverage declines, how do we sort of address these issues with our European allies, who, as you say, are sort of our most important allies? How do we do that without either trying to sort of ham-fistedly bully them, or because they do have a fairly different conception, or at least these conceptions of their national interests are diverging in certain ways that transcend the current administration's issues here.
Yeah. First, we ought to, as we've talked about tonight, is simply recognize the value set of Europe to the United States, which I would say is first and foremost our shared view of democratic norms. That's crucial. Number two, it's the economic throw weight of Europe. It's as I mentioned, it's the largest economy in the world, larger than that of the United States, larger than that of China. Number three is recognize the geographic importance of Europe. It sits as a series of strategic forward operating stations for the United States if we're going to engage in Africa, Central Asia, the Levant. Fourth, it's the most technologically advanced area of the world, with the possible exception of the United States. China's coming up rapidly, but if you really look at tech, there's a lot going on in Europe that's very powerful. And fifth and finally, we've already got an alliance. We don't have to invent one. It's been around for 70 years. So I think the value proposition of Europe is quite high. We should recognize that and celebrate it. Number two, we should send our leaders to Europe frequently. Number three, we should invite European leaders here. Number four, we should exercise what sometimes is called track 2 diplomacy. That's engaging our institutions of higher education, our tech companies, at a policy level to work together. And here I'd particularly draw a line under cyber. Fifth and finally, we need, just as we walked away from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, we still have flickers of the Atlantic version of that, a trade zone between Europe and the United States. It makes enormous sense. It's called TTIP. That's still kind of bubbling, and the Trump administration has said they're interested in engaging in that one. So I think if we did those things rationally and coherently, we had a strategy for dealing with Europe, we would be far better served. Let me close by making a point about service, completely different than anything we've talked about, because a number of people have said to me tonight very nicely, Admiral, thank you for your service, and I appreciate that. I was in the U.S. military for 37 years. Here's my point. There's a lot of ways to serve this country. Our diplomats, our CIA officers, our Peace Corps volunteers, Teach for America, Volunteer for America, our police, our firemen, our EMTs, school teachers in rural Ohio making $42,000 a year teaching kindergarten. You think they're serving the country? I do. Nurses in small inner city clinics, volunteers all over this country. There's a lot of ways to serve the country. So I appreciate it when people say thank you for your service. I'd ask all of you, as you see others who are serving the country in some way, thank them too. And then for the young people who are here, I hope you find a time in your life when you can serve. Not just in the military, obviously, but in any of those zones. And I would also say to all the teachers in the room, to the educators in the room, and that's what I want to close on, to all who are engaged in education, you serve the country. Thank you for your service. Thanks for having me here tonight. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much.